This is now week 3. I can't believe we're already on our 3rd week of Conchas y Café for Volume 6, Issue 1. I guess to start off, I want to ask, how did you guys do this week with the writing prompt? Did you guys enjoy it? Did you feel like there was any questions that you had kind of pending about the apophatic term? Anything like that? No? All right. Well,
I enjoyed it, and I appreciate your feedback. So I have work to do, but I enjoyed I enjoyed it.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
Glad to hear. Hello, Judith.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. To me, it was very, not very, but it was more difficult because I couldn't join the class last week. So it's not the same, I think. So I watched the whole video, the whole class, and I was taking notes, but I guess it's not the same as that being on live, because I can ask you right away and I can hear the rest and then learn from them, because I don't think I didn't really get it. That's what I didn't turn it in, but yeah, I'm working on it. So and today I wanted to do with the Chrome, the computer, instead of the phone, because everything is really little and it's hard for me to, I'm new at these, but I'm getting in there. So I guess we're learning. So yeah, it's that. So I may ask you questions by mail or something later on. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and the same goes with everyone, right? If you have any questions and you need me to clarify, you can always message me on Google Classroom, or you can email me directly. Those of you that have my cell phone, you can obviously text me too. Yeah, the class is obviously recorded, so you can always go back and revisit anything that maybe you didn't understand. And yeah, I guess just as a reminder, if you have a question while I'm talking during the recording, just kind of either flag me down or unmute yourself and go ahead and just ask. I'll give you the space. So yeah. So if anybody does anybody, before I do move on though, does anybody have any questions about apophasis and what we talked about last week? And yes, Mauricio.
I guess I was just a little confused with apophasis and comparing something like, I don't know the term for it, but it's like describing things like maybe a car with like human characteristics, because essentially you're still describing something for what it's not. Is there any difference between those two? Or do they overlap?
They kind of overlap in the sense that the idea is to say what it is not, right? So a car does not have feet. The car does not have a mustache, but it can smile. So like the apophasis is the act of explaining something by saying what it is not.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is basically comes down to a comparison or some kind of metaphor.
I'm still working on mine. So.
All right. Yeah. No problem. Yeah, like there's no set due date for your weekly assignment, but the writing prompts for every week are really just to sort of inspire you. You don't have to even do the writing prompt. It's just hopefully a way for you to get your creative juices going. So, yeah. All right then. So I guess we'll just move along then, right? So yes, as Tina had mentioned before, today's handout is going to feature a poem by Courtney Merrow. But before we get into that in particular, let's start off with our quote of the week. So, la cita de esta semana nos viene de Orson Scott Card, y él es un autor norteamericano, y él escribe fantasía y ciencia ficción. Y esta cita viene de Portavoz de los Muertos, que es uno de sus libros más famosos. If in case you haven't heard of Orson Scott Card, aside from being the author of Speaker for the Dead, he's also the author that wrote Ender's Game, which I believe was turned into a movie a couple of years ago, and it's a pretty well-known science fiction story. And he wrote, "Every person is defined by the communities she belongs to. Cada persona es definida por las comunidades cual le pertenece." So, hopefully you were able to see the screen. And I'll copy and paste the quote in our chat here too, so you can reference it. But what do you guys think? What is the general sense of the message that you get from this quote for this week? Any takers? Get us started.
We are influenced by our context, by the people we love, and we are surrounded by.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And we may belong to different communities. We may have different small communities in different parts of our lives, but we're defined by those communities that we're a part of.
And also, we're defined by how we react to those communities as well, because we could very much be a part of a community we don't accept either.
Yeah.
So
I think too, it's like we don't develop in a vacuum. Like we're shaped by the people around us, like our parents, our grandparents, our friends, and in a lot of ways we're just like we're part of a larger community. It's not just as individuals.
Yeah, definitely.
And that Luis facilitates, this is a community.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely look at that as I mean, Conchas y Café is definitely a community. You know, there's a reason why I refer to you guys as the arts fam, because it's like a little family, and all of us are supporting each other in different ways. And one of those ways is obviously through learning together. But
Yeah.
I think that Jorge made a really valid point, and a very important one. We don't develop in a vacuum either, right? We belong to other communities, and just like Nettie said, we are informed by all of the different communities that we're a part of. Judith?
And at the end, we turn into a mosaic of different communities, because we carry with us along our lives our past communities, because we're coming from different places, and then all of that it goes with us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really beautiful image to think of, right? We're a mosaic of community. Mauricio?
Oh, that was just.
Okay.
I was agreeing.
Okay. Yeah, I thought for a second you had another thing to add, but good. So again, think about that quote, right? Every person is defined by the communities she belongs to. Cada persona es definida por las comunidades cual le pertenece. Is it true that we're defined by it as well? No. I see you shaking your head, Jorge. Could you elaborate?
I would say that we're shaped by it, but we're not necessarily defined by it, right? Because we don't have just one voice. We have like a multitude of voices. And so I think it doesn't necessarily define us, because we can come from a certain place, but we can develop as a completely different person. Just because I think about myself and my brother, and how we're two different people, but yet we were born in the same circumstances. So yeah.
Yeah. Abraham?
Well, I feel like in a forest, every animal is still part of the ecosystem, and it's the characteristics of each animal it has to do with the ecosystem that it lives in, right? So like a polar bear is fit for the snow and everything, not the same as all the animals, but it's adapted to that ecosystem. So I think it's the same in art or in a community.
Yeah. Carlos, did you have something to add? Sorry, Carlos, I can't hear you. I see that you're not muted though. Maybe you need to get a bit closer to the microphone. Still can't hear you, Carlos. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was saying that it was this could also be like in a negative way, like when you get like stereotyped because you're from a certain community. You know, I guess it's mostly what happens. I think. I kind of like, I hate to be like the negative one to bring this up because everyone's like bringing really beautiful things about community and all that. But yeah, I feel like this also kind of like comes in a negative way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, that's sort of why I wanted to have that conversation. Like, are we actually defined by the communities? Right? I think Jorge said it really well. You know, he and his brother may have grown up in same or similar circumstances, but they are still two individuals. You know, I think that's important, right? Just because we're part of that same community doesn't mean that we're going to be identical to the community in every way. Mauricio?
Yeah, I agree with Jorge and Carlos said. And also, I think that the communities that we're part of, like those stereotypes that go along with them, I think also, you know, our voice does not necessarily be what those communities think of what our community is about. Like, I think of maybe like Hollywood and how they portray Latinos and Latinas. And they're kind of stereotyped into these, you know, very limited roles. And just because they're viewed in that way as that community doesn't mean that's the whole truth as well.
Mhm.
So I feel like I agree with what they were saying, as you know, that community also is kind of limited to how every other community sees them, whether or not it's accurate.
Yeah. I think that's really important for us to consider too. Nettie?
I think that we can evolve the idea that yes, we are defined by our communities, but there are always outliers. That seems to be the case. And also, whenever we speak about stereotypes, we create like the stereotype of the stereotype, and oftentimes we forget that there is like a counter stereotype that is often overlooked.
Yeah.
Maybe every single time we encounter a stereotype, maybe we got a chance to come with a counterpoint. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that phrase. You know, the counter stereotype.
Yeah, like a teaching moment.
Yeah. I think so like a quick little thing that happened to me today. I was on a meeting earlier today, and I was talking with a representative from another organization, and because DSTL Arts is a Latino or led organization, for whatever reason, they assumed that it also meant that I teach graffiti art, or that I'm connected to the graffiti art community. And I see a couple of you kind of smiling, a couple of you surprised. Like, I find it kind of funny, and I also find it kind of funny because the fact that the person that I was talking to was also Latina, it sort of was like this stereotype reinforcing another stereotype. And just because I come from the Latino community, and yes, I do have a background in graffiti art, that doesn't mean that DSTL Arts is a graffiti art focused organization, or an organization that is only focused on teaching arts through graffiti or urban culture. So I think that's a good example, right, of how a community might try to define itself and then therefore define you. So I do want to at least acknowledge, right, that we can be defined by community. We are a mosaic of all of the communities that we belong to, but it's not just one community that owns our voice that we can represent, right? We can represent multiple communities, regardless of who we are, regardless of our age, our gender, our ethnic background, our race. All of those things, they're not universal. And I think that this quote kind of tries to get at that. It tries to get at this idea that we're not universal. because it is communities, right? It's more than one community that defines us. But I also want to challenge that idea of definition. You know, are we actually defined by our communities? And I think we kind of see that a little bit in the poem that I selected for today. El poema que vamos a leer esta semana viene de Courtney Merrill. So just like as I had mentioned before, and if you did download the handout, you'll see that the handout obviously has it in English and in Spanish, but you'll see also that Courtney Merrill is considered an emerging writer and editor, and she comes from Cleveland, Ohio. So even that idea, right, of being an emerging writer, you know, a person that hasn't quite established themselves as a writer, you know, there's like this assumption that maybe they don't have a voice yet that is very clearly defined. And so the technique that's used in this particular poem is something that I feel like is a very good place for not just any writer that is starting off, but all writers that have been doing their writing for a very long time. It's a good technique for us to use to sort of put ourselves in a situation where, you know, maybe we are defining a community and we're defining it based on our individual identity. So, aquí les presento el poema Muñecas American Girl asiste en un entrenamiento mandatorio para la diversidad. American Girl dolls attend mandatory diversity training. Do I have a volunteer that would like to give this one a shot? Like to read it? Mauricio? Go for it, my friend.
Meet Kristen, wears milkmaid braids to conserve her Swedish past, relinquished herself to assimilation at 8 after saying bye to her BFF singing bird, whose tribe was forced off their land. 1854 was a wild year for me, guys. Cancer culture is raping. But how could I disown my family for the racist things they say? How could I even point out that the things that they say are racist? Like, how could I even say, can you consider the words coming out of my mouth and never say them again? Should I keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Meet Molly. Buys baguettes on Mondays and wears a beret, literally everywhere. Obsessed with Hollywood films and harsh realities. Surprisingly patriotic, despite her love of all things British, especially Glad. An expert on taking up space. When the trainer asks if anyone can define discrimination, she pulls out a legal pad. I can't even tell you how many times I've been discriminated against because I'm a woman. I write literally every instance down as proof. Exactly how many hours do we have? Meet Samantha, 25-year-old well-meaning rule lover who enjoys progress and satin. Would love to be a painter or possibly the president of the United States of America. Out of the 2 AMA questions received before the training, both came from her. One for each Black person she's ever talked to in her life. This is more of a comment than anything, but I don't understand why I can't be curious about Addie's hair. Remind me again, what's the difference between equality and equity? Meet Felicity. Wears wide brim hats for horse races and can stitch the shit out of anything. Makes a mean southern sweet tea, just like her mommy used to in an old Virginia colony. When the diversity trainer asked if anyone can recall a time in their lives when they've been racist, she had a hard time pinning down just one time. Sure, I could, but I'd rather focus on rescuing horses from alopecia than spend a few hours with this dumbass training. Honestly, who has the time for any of this? Meet Addie. Just look at all these dolls crying, complaining, and getting paid for it all. Meanwhile, Hot Girl Summer came and left, and I'm still stuck here performing history. I'm gonna just slap the next bitch who tries to buy me. Scholars who brought me to life built the best American story, but forgot 2 key facts. 1, I'm tired of being sold. 2, less than half the people who buy me actually listen. If I raised my hand right now and asked, do I really need to be here? I think my boss would just let me leave.
Excellent. Thank you, Mauricio. All right. ¿Y en español? ¿Hay alguien quien me lo quiera leer en español?
Yo lo puedo leer, pero no lo veo en mi pantalla, maestro.
Oh.
No se va a poder, ¿verdad?
Bueno, si no lo puede leer en la
Yeah,
pantalla,
no.
I guess not.
Yeah. Okay. Paso.
Okay. Is there anybody that can? Nettie?
I can try.
Okay. All right, Nettie, ahí te va.
Okay. Let me start by the title. Muñecas American Girl asisten a un entrenamiento mandatorio para la diversidad por Courtney Morrow. Conoce Kirsten, luce trenzas de lechera para conservar su pasado sueco. Se dejó a la asimilación a los 8 años de edad después de despedirse de su BFF, ave cantante, cuyo tribu fue forzada de sus terrenos ancestrales. 1854 fue un año pésimo para mí, muchachas. La cultura cancelista es real, pero ¿cómo puedo repudiar a mi familia por las cosas racistas que dicen? ¿Cómo puedo llamarles la atención que las cosas que dicen son racistas? O sea, cómo les digo, pueden considerar las palabras que salen de su boca y jamás decirlas otra vez? Conocen Molly. Compra baguetes los lunes y luce una boina literalmente en todos lugares. Obsesionada con películas de Hollywood y las duras realidades, sorprendentemente patriótica, a pesar de su fascinación con todas las cosas británicas, especialmente la tela escocesa. Experta en el acto de tomar lugar. Cuando el entrenador pregunta si alguien puede definir la discriminación, ella saca una tableta de papel legal. No puedo decirte las cosas que me han discriminado, las tantas veces que me han discriminado por ser mujer. Literalmente escribo cada instancia como comprobante. Exactamente cuántas horas tenemos. Conoce Samantha, amante de reglas, bien intencionada, de 25 años de edad, que admira el progreso y el sartén. Quisiera ser pintora o posiblemente presidenta de los Estados Unidos. De las dos preguntas, ambas recibidas antes del entrenamiento, las dos fueron de ella. Una por cada persona negra con quien ha platicado en toda su vida. Número 1. Esta es más comentario que nada, pero no entiendo por qué no puedo tener una curiosidad por el pelo de Ari. Número 2. Recuérdame otra vez, ¿cuál es la diferencia entre la igualdad y la equidad? Conoce Felicity. Usa sombreros grandes para las carreras de caballo. Puede tener a la madre cualquier. Hace un té dulce bien chingón, igualito a su madre, como cuando en la vieja colonia. Cuando el entrenador de la diversidad pregunta si alguien puede recordar un té cuando ellos fueron racistas, a ella se le hace difícil nombrar siquiera una opción. Claro que puedo, pero prefiero enfocarme en el rescate de los caballos. Pasar unas horas en este departamento. ¿Quién tiene tiempo para todo esto? Conoce Ari. Y no más mira a estas muñecas llorando. Mientras esperando que la chica buena llegó. Yo cantar aquí a un religioso la historia. Voy a cantar a la próxima persona que intente comprarme. Los eruditos que me dieron vida construyeron el mejor cuento americano, pero se les olvidó dos hechos claves. Estoy harta de ser vendida. Menos de la mitad de la gente que me compra actualmente escucha. Pero si levanto la mano ahorita y pregunto, ¿de verdad necesito estar aquí? ¿Crees que mi patrón me deja ir?
Good job, Nettie. Ojalá y, the little glitches or whatever in the audio didn't hurt you guys too much with the skipping of some words. Pero gracias, Nettie. Muy bien hecho. So, what do you guys think of the poem? Jesus?
I had fun with it.
Yeah? Could you tell me why you had fun with it?
Well, I could almost picture the characters that I'm trying to think. I guess think of people that that might fit that those descriptions if I had come across any of them in my life. Um, yeah, and a really interesting format as far as how to get your point across.
Yeah,
You know, it's
right?
a setting. It's a setting that we all encounter. You know, training in which we're all surrounded by people sometimes that we don't know, and we listen to them speak, and it's always pretty amazing to me what people say. So, yeah, it just took me to that place.
Definitely. Abraham, did you have something to add?
Yeah, for me, it kind of remind me of, remember the documentary, the toys that made us?
Yeah.
Kind of how they say like a little intro each toy, like the little backstory behind a toy. So that kind of reminds me like a Barbie girl kind of thing, and telling you what this toy or person, or in this case like dolls, right, represent, and they're like how they're supposed to be, right? But even some of them are like, I prefer to tell you about something else rather than what I just appear to look like, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Mauricio?
I like the approach. I feel like each of the 5 dolls had a different voice that I think the first 4 were pretty spot on in terms of arguments of how to not talk about diversity or racism. I feel like that's like the way that they described themselves was pretty well written. So I do like that approach.
Yeah.
And I agree that some of those voices sounded like people I know. So.
Yeah. I have a question for everyone. So Mauricio, made the observation that it was the dolls introducing themselves. Did it come across as them introducing themselves, or was it one voice that was describing them? Like the Abraham kind of giving a 50-50 there. Eddie?
I think like the last doll was the one who wrapped up things and made the most important point. I actually can resonate with the last doll a lot. And I believe that, ugly people practice racism and well-intended people perpetuate it. That's what I think.
That's a great way to put it. That is a great way to put it. Yeah. Ugly people practice racism. Well-intentioned people perpetuate it. I think that's a very good observation, Eddie. Thank you. So when you look at the poem, I think that it's pretty obvious that it's not necessarily the doll that's introducing themselves. There is another voice that's introducing them. And we could probably, by the end of the poem, say that it's most likely Addie, the black doll, that's actually introducing everyone else. Right. And I would say that that's because of the way that the dolls are being described. Some of the key details that come up, like in the case of, well, let's start off with the first one, right? Kirsten wears milk-maid braids to conserve her Swedish past, relinquished herself to assimilation at 8 after saying bye to her BFF Singing Bird, whose tribe was forced off their land. 1854 was a wild year for me, guys. Cancel culture is real. But how could I disown my family for the racist things they say? How could I even point out that the things they say are racist? Like, how could I even say, can you consider the words coming out of your mouth and never say them again? I think that voice, that persona that's used, because that's ultimately what it is. It's a persona. That way that she's being characterized is really coming, I think, from a person of color, right? From the author taking on a persona to say, this is how that particular character comes across. Mauricio, see you wrote in the chat there. Yeah, that first line usually starts with an action. but Addie's voice sounds like she's summing them all up for every other doll. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. So it kind of starts off with a description, right, of the doll, like a very basic, superficial description. Then it's followed by really the doll's actions, their words. So, and I think Ms. Luz kind of talked a little bit about this, but how many of you have been in a situation where you have to attend a diversity training or a training that's about, say, like sexual harassment, and you have people who sort of miss the point of the training? I see a couple little smiles there. Yeah. Yeah. What was your experience in that type of situation? And maybe you could describe it too, just a little bit, without naming names, perhaps. Any takers on that? Anybody want to talk about that experience? Mauricio?
I
Yeah, I have.
Here you can go.
I'll go for it. Sorry.
All right, Mauricio, then Carlos.
In my corporate job, I had every one of us had a sexual harassment training, and it's not to throw shade on anyone, but a lot of the people there were kind of a certain age, so they had very, they were set in their ways of thinking. So they use that platform kind of as a way to express how sensitive people are. And back in my day, we used to do this, and I don't see why it's a problem. So some of the younger, I guess, employees would, some of them would kind of look at them. They're like, oh, they're just in part of a different era. But there were actually some people like closer to my age that actually thought the same way. They're like, yeah, people are very sensitive nowadays. And I tried to listen to both sides because there has to be some credence to what they're saying. But at the same time, they're missing the whole point of why it's important to have sexual harassment training.
Right.
Because in the past, things weren't expressed as well, or people just didn't have that same power of voice to express things that make them uncomfortable that they do now. And I think they just missed that point completely. And they just complained that, well, almost like they, I don't know, like they would hint that maybe they're doing it for malicious purposes, like claiming sexual harassment because they don't like someone.
Yeah, that's a very shady way of using that tool, right?
Yeah.
But I think it was one observation I want to make to what you said, Mauricio, is you made the observation of sometimes it wasn't just the older generation of people that were saying things that sounded against sexual harassment. It was also younger people too. And I think that's a good example of how we're not necessarily defined by our community. Because while a person might define or identify with the older generation, that community, quote unquote, is not necessarily universally defined as being, anti-sexual harassment or whatever the case might be. So I think that's a good observation to make. Carlos?
Yeah, it's good thing you brought the thing about sexual harassment. I was gonna mention the same thing. I went to one of those where I used to work. It was like it was like a very fast-paced work environment. So nobody really had time to think about those things. So when that came up, we watched like a video, and it kind of like backfired because after the video and all the training, it was kind of funny. I guess now you see it's funny now, but it's probably not correct. That everyone's just kind of like staring at each other, kind of like, okay, who's gonna break the first laugh? And then it was just like, it was obviously the guys that started like, laughing at the first things, and then after that, like, I guess all the examples of the jokes that you were not supposed to make, and then people started making them. So it kind of like it backfired, and obviously like you see it really more like on the males. I think that's I don't know. They're probably, I don't know. Maybe I'm just assuming, but they're probably targeted for like a male audience because we grew up. I grew up. I admit I grew up in a pretty dumb environment. Where where you're like you just wanna you try to be funny and with the sex jokes and like it took me a while to I guess try to like wash that out and be respectful to women, to everyone. I think.
I very much appreciate you acknowledging your own need to sort of change your thinking and your behaviors. I think that's really important. And I also want to say that I think you're right, Carlos. Like I feel like especially sexual harassment trainings and things like that are definitely more targeted towards men because let's be realistic. And most office environments, it's probably men who are going to be the ones that violate that the most. Just because we're not the smartest of the bunch. So but that being said, like there's also men that are very aware of that and are cognizant of the fact that we want to have equity. We want to have an environment where women feel as equally as empowered as men to do whatever. And so it's not a universal thing. Again, the community that we belong to doesn't necessarily define us always. There's also moments though, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I know I've experienced it where I'm the only person of color in a room full of white people. And then there's a comment that's made, that sort of generalizes and creates this stereotype or expresses a stereotype. And so then there I am as the only Latino who has to now represent ultimately all Latino voices and all Black voices and all Asian voices, and I'm limited to my own experiences. So I'm put in that conundrum, right? What do I do? Do I represent all people of color, or do I just speak to my own experience? I see a few heads nodding. Please share your experience with that. Hey, Jorge or Abraham, I saw both of you nodding your heads.
Well, in terms of representing, I never believed myself as the voice for all men or the voice for all Latinos, right? So I tend to just speak for my own experience and especially when it comes to art, people say, "Oh, what do you like, Frida Kahlo and all that stuff?" Well, it's not who I am, right? And they always expect the Latino artists, the brown artists, to represent certain demographic or certain ideals. And as I always say, like I can only speak for myself, and I invite other people to go and research more about the community that they expected me to be, but I'm not. So that's kind of my own experience on that regard.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too that I think it's important for us to kind of push back against that monolith, right? Because we're not all the same, right? We're very different, and we form part of this larger community. But like Judith had said, we're more of a mosaic, right? It's those that kind of try to stereotype us, that try to like simplify us into these basic stereotypes of who they want us to be, but we're actually much more than that, right? We're complicated, complex humans. And so I think that in a way attempts to erase ourselves, right? And so, yeah.
Thank you guys for sharing that. Yeah. Tina?
Okay, so one time, I'm not going to name names, but it was a long time ago, at a Conchas meeting. And somebody called to attention that I was a white girl and that I don't know, I don't remember what he said, but just kind of pointing it out, that I kind of felt like I was stuck out a little bit. And here I thought I was blending in, and I was like, that's weird. That's a weird thing to say, and I just I was over just saying hello, and something about white girls, blah, 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 or something like that, something to the effect. Mm-hmm. I was just shocked. That's all.
I have to I have to defend Tina, yeah, because I've been in certain circles where I hear that a lot, like white people here, and people tend to generalize really fast, and I have been able to like stick up for like those people sometimes when I have the chance to say, hey, you don't know everybody, so you might as well just get to know them before you talk smack about them, especially. So yeah, Tina, sorry.
And I agree too, because like if we don't want to be stereotyped as Latinos, we shouldn't stereotype others as well. Like we shouldn't speak the language of the oppressors by oppressed. You know what I mean? So it's like it's kind of like we're going down to like the level of those who oppress us.
Yeah, it's using the same tactic that they're using to, to kind of segregate and box us in, and we're using the same tactic. So
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that, kind of like what Abraham is saying, we need to really get to know everyone before we can start making generalizations and judgments. And I'm sorry, Tina, that you had to experience that in one of our own workshops, because that's not the purpose. That's not the goal of these workshops. It's to hopefully have conversations like these where we can really get to know each other. Because ultimately that's what our writing does. It shows people who we are in a voice that we choose, in our own particular voice, which is very valuable and important.
Thank you. I just blame the person, not anybody else.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Mauricio?
well, I have an example of something that happened to me. In college, I was giving a presentation at a kind of like a day-long seminar, and towards the end, the keynote speaker went up to speak, and he was Latino as well. He was from South America, and I had identified as Colombian American. And after the seminar was over, I actually went up to him to ask him for his business card to see maybe we can do business. And him being Latino actually addressed me and saying, "Oh, el colombiano." He looked over to his assistant and he said, "Oh, give him a card, pobrecito." So
What the fuck?
right. In English, pobrecito, it's like, oh, poor guy. Like, give this guy a bone. So I at the time I couldn't even register everything that was going through my head, because was I being stereotyped as a Colombian for being of something I should be ashamed of, or whether it's something that because of the stereotypes I shouldn't claim. And I was too confused to be angry at that point. I threw away his card right away. I kind of made a scene about it.
Well,
But
I give you props for definitely responding in that way, because yeah, that's obviously being very dismissive of who you are, and the value that you bring as a person. And I think that for just about everyone, regardless of your background, especially if you're part of a community that is often not represented in a way that feels equal or that feels respected, we've all had some level of interaction where we're treated that way. And there's tools that we can use, at least as writers, I think, that we can develop and polish to say what we need to say in a way that really gets the point across. So to sort of bring it back to the poem, and I mentioned the term before, but the poem uses persona, right? And persona it's a rhetorical strategy. Hopefully you can see my screen. Let me scroll down to the bottom of the handout here. But it's a rhetorical strategy that you're probably familiar with and have heard before, right? Persona has a couple of different definitions. Some of them I left on here because I found them kind of interesting. But persona is a character assumed by an author in a written work. And in Spanish es un personaje. Personaje es la voz asumida por un autor en obras literarias. Now, the other definitions I find kind of interesting. So definition 2A, the plural of it, personas, is an individual's social facade or front that, especially in the analytic psychology of Carl Jung, reflects the role in life the individual is playing. esa definición de personaje en particular para mí se me hizo muy interesante. Y aquí en español es el plural personajes, las fachadas sociales de un ser, especialmente en la psicología analítica de Carl Jung, que refleja el papel que toma uno durante su vida. Además, personaje también significa la personalidad que proyecta una persona al público, tal como un actor o político. So it's also the personality that a person, such as an actor or politician, projects in public. And of course, the last one, the plural personae, a character in a fictional presentation, such as a novel or play, usually used in plural. Ese es el que quizá más se reconoce como personaje. Un personaje de una obra ficticia, tal como en novela o obra teatral, típicamente usado en plural. Los personajes. Persona, as you can see, is not just necessarily the voice that's used, but it's also like a facade, right? And I think that one is a really interesting one. It's a social facade that we use at any given moment in our life to sort of play a role. I saw a message right now, sorry, in the chat from Miss Michelle. Playing colorism class. I think that's in response to your particular story, Mauricio, about a person basically showing pity on you because you're Colombian. And one could even say that that's part of their persona, right? That's how they behave in public, to say, oh, pobre colombianito, hay que darle una tarjeta. That's deeply insulting. And it's a facade. Maybe deep down inside, maybe that person doesn't really believe that, but maybe they really do. And that's just how they present themselves to the public. But thinking about the poem and thinking about persona, what do you think the author, Courtney Burroughs, was trying to do by writing in persona? What was the purpose of using persona to express what she was expressing? Any thoughts or ideas?
Well, I think that like the persona, it's kind of like it does become a little bit of like the stereotype, right? And I think she like pushes the stereotype in a way to sort of like I don't, yeah, get, and these are like, they're stereotypes, but they do actually, like we said before, they're like people that we can all kind of recognize, and we've all heard these things before. So I feel like it's like using the persona kind of I don't know, it just pushes it to the extreme, so it kind of just shows just how ridiculous it is, I guess, and it just like also kind of shows like I know it's like makes fun of it. Like that's kind of what it does. I think it allows the poet to kind of make fun of all of these different types of personas, and I think making fun of them kind of takes away some of their power. I think like humor and comedy and irony and all that can we kind of use as a way to like take power away from people who traditionally do have power.
That's absolutely right, Caro. Thank you. Ultimately, that's really, I think, what the point was of the poem, right? If the author were to have written in a way that, I don't know, maybe was just more observational and not actually using parody to really oversimplify those stereotypes of the white dolls compared to the black doll, I don't know if we would have gotten the same kind of poem. Do you think that we would have gotten the same sort of anger that's expressed in this poem if the personas weren't so over the top? See some heads shaking. Yeah, I don't think so. See, Karen wrote in the chat, it does create a meta comment about the American Girl culture. If in case you're not familiar with American Girl is it's a doll that I don't know exactly the size, but they're really tall, and they're basically stereotypes. You know, there's the one just like is in the poem that is dressed kind of like in French clothing and is meant to be sort of like a French doll, but she's white. And I'm sure, just like with Barbie, there's probably only one girl, one American Doll girl of color that's meant to sort of stand in for all of the other people of color. Unless if they've started, diversifying their.
Oh no,
products.
they've diversified. I looked on their website really quickly, and it's funny because I think they've taken some of these dolls out of circulation because like you can Google them and still find them, but they're not on their. I couldn't see them on their website or listed like on their main website. But now they have like a bunch of like people different skin colors, tones on their front page at least. So I think they're trying. I think they're trying to be in with the trend and forget their racist past.
Right. But what is the history of dolls in the United States? Started off with almost always exclusively a white doll with white skin tone. And then later, eventually, there was the black doll, right, with the darker skin tone. And it took probably until either the 80s or the 90s for us to finally see dolls with a brown skin tone. Judith?
Yeah, I don't know for how long, but now you can send a picture of your girl and I don't know where is it, but Judy had one as a gift and they name it after your daughter. You can send it, like I said, the picture and then create the features of your daughter or niece or friend or whoever, and then they name it too. So you have your own doll. So, but that's recent. Of course, I get it after all that polemic, that they create.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was probably out of necessity because they started to recognize people weren't buying their dolls because they weren't diverse. They weren't representing all the stories. So all of that, I think, is kind of reflected in the poem, right? I don't think that the anger and the use of the persona being so over the top with the characterizations really would have given us the same kind of poem, right? We got something that expresses a sense of inequality, and I think that persona can really be used in that way. Sometimes we have to take on that role. There were moments when I was in college where being the only Latino in the class, I had to speak to what it was like to be a person of color and what it was like to not have always a meal for, every dinner. I had to speak to those things because that was part of my reality. And, people talking about Mexicans being lazy was something I couldn't just sit by and take, So persona can work that way. It can work that way if you're a person that is disabled. You could take on the persona of, that point of view of being a person with a disability and speaking to all the able-bodied people that think that you can't do something because you're somehow quote unquote lacking. Right? Sometimes taking on that role, that sort of facade, of just one community, sometimes that is part of what we need to do in order to express a message. Sometimes. Doesn't mean that that's going to define us though, right? I definitely think that it's important that we remember we are a mosaic of all the communities that we represent. But because we represent them, because we identify with them, I think that we do have a right to speak to those things. And so as part of your voice, as you develop your voice as a writer, I encourage you to take on that persona, write from persona. So the last thing, Karen just asked if I could comment to cultural appropriation. I can, but I think that it's important for us to all discuss it. What does cultural appropriation mean to you? Anybody want to try to tackle that? Mauricio?
I think it's kind of like, I don't know, taking up a voice of a culture that you may not be totally, I don't know, like with. Maybe you support them, but you can't really speak from experience. rights type of thing.
I think that's a good way to put it. Caro?
Yeah, I think Mauricio is right. Like, yeah, it's about, taking somebody's culture that you're not a part of, that you're not connected to. But I think the other part of it is also like using it for someone to benefit yourself. So like if you take, something from another culture and then, you like sell it, like, like white people selling sage, for example, and like, that's that would be an example of cultural appropriation, because you're now profiting off of like something that is not part of who you are at all, and you're just using that as a way to benefit yourself.
Right.
Well, I have an experience. I was doing a photo shoot, and I wanted to do an Indian style photo shoot. And I remember I have everything going on. And then the lady who was gonna let me use some dresses, she was asking me who was gonna wear the dresses. And I told her, well, the model is this Native American mixed whatever. And she said, no, sorry, we cannot use it because she's not part of my culture. And I find that this difference between appropriating a culture and using it. Appropriating, I feel, is more when you're using it and not giving it its due and not being respectful. Otherwise, everybody will be using just sombreros if you're Mexican, Indian dresses if you're Indian. I think that sharing cultures is what makes this world more of a interesting and exciting place for me. So I always try to make that difference. Like, everybody should be able to taste the culture they want to taste, and of course without being disrespectful. But I feel like that's a big difference there.
There is a difference. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a difference between like a cultural melting pot and cultural appropriation, which is, like Gato said, it's more of a commodification of a culture to make money out of it, right? I think like Urban Outfitters is a good example, right? They commodify urban culture, they commodify indigenous culture to what? To sell to upper class suburban house kids, so they can wear this like wear these clothes that they don't even know the meaning and symbolic meaning behind it, right? And who's making the profit out of that? It's not the culture, right? It's not the people who it's like corporate interests. So I think there is a distinction, right? I mean, to value like a melting pot, to value all these cultures, but not to make profit out of them, right?
I think that's a key part of it is, who ends up benefiting from this representation of this culture. Cultural appropriation is basically everything that you've all already said, but it's also being, I think, it's also being very much aware of, how you're representing a culture, and if you are using it to your own personal benefit. So kind of like how Mauricio put in the chat about it being like a person that's claiming Native American ancestry, but is in fact maybe only like 5% indigenous, but then still turning around and using that as a way to get into college or to, I don't know, claim that they have the right to wear a particular style of clothing or a particular way of I don't know, making headdresses or whatever the case might be, right? But it's also a person just simply saying, like a person from northwest United States saying that, they can sell, I don't know, the work of Hopi Native American peoples, and because they're an indigenous tribe that's based in the Northwest, they can then also claim the indigenous tribe of the Southwest. So it could be not just white people claiming a person of color's culture, but it could also be a person of color claiming another person of color's culture as if it was somehow equal to theirs or their own too. Right.
Yeah.
So cultural appropriation can happen in a lot of different ways and a lot of different levels.
Yeah. And I don't know if everybody agree, but another good example, not only of cultural appropriation, but also not profit, it's Halloween customs. And I have friends that get offended and I understand because, like Ron was saying, I mean, not all Mexicans somos Pepe Fiesta, ¿no? O usamos sombreros. So, entonces, I think that's another good example of culture appropriation and doing profit.
Yeah, exactly. See, Karen, I see you. Is that raising a hand on the chat?
Yeah, there's no raise hand feature on Google Meet. There's no way to raise my hand. But anyhow, like this is a really important question for me, especially in terms of like this persona thing that you're talking about, because like I would want to speak to some things that I know, you know what I mean, or some things that are from my world. But let's say I might be speaking in the voice of an Asian American, you know what I mean, or whatever. And I think there's now in me a lot of hesitancy because I don't want it to be seen as cultural appropriation. It's just more of me speaking out of my context. But like, how do I walk that line?
I think that the best way to approach persona, especially with the assignment that ultimately we're discussing, right? Persona is kind of taking, perhaps you could look at it this way. You're taking one of the stereotypes that people might have of you and then just making it like a hyper stereotype to the point where it becomes so ridiculous that it makes the point of whatever it is that your stereotype is combating, right? If we look at the poem by Courtney Burrow, she uses the voice of Addie, which is the one black doll that's being represented, and using that voice to speak out against racism and the way that, you know, the people in power, ultimately the white dolls, are not necessarily acknowledging their complicity in racism and inequality. Right, so I mean, based on the way that you identify, Karen, you could maybe approach the writing prompt in a way that you feel speaks to whoever might be your for lack of a better word, oppressor, right? As a woman, as a woman that identifies in a particular way, you know, you could potentially speak to, say, men and, you know, the patriarchal structure of society. Right? It's just an example. I hope that kind of helps.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because, you know, sometimes you use multiple, like for example, you use multiple voices, right?
I think that's up for interpretation. You know, I don't know if she uses multiple voices more than, you know, the voice of the speaker of the poem and then the voice of Addie to, you know, represent the rest of the characters.
And then does it always have to be like what if you're doing it more in a way of not so much dealing with oppression, but maybe I don't know, maybe in a more lighthearted way, or maybe in a way of bringing out some things to celebrate? Does that make sense? Like, does it have to be in that kind of? Yeah.
I think that's more of a content question, and so I would have to leave that up to you. You know, what is the message that you're hoping to convey through your persona? Like, to give an example, I once did a poem that's a persona poem where I took on the persona of the Joker from Batman. And so I was speaking from my imagined voice of what the Joker might sound like in critiquing the characters, the people that have played Batman up to this point. You know, and I use it as a way to critique the way that mental health is actually not acknowledged in the Joker, and that maybe Batman is actually the one that's mentally ill, not the Joker. So I mean, there's definitely different ways that you could address different issues by using even made up characters, like I said, like the Joker. Thank you guys. I see the chat. It was actually, that poem was published several years ago in the San Diego Poetry Annual. Yeah, I could share it next week with you guys. So, yeah, I hope that helps clarify the way that persona could be used. So, if there's no other questions, I'd like to actually show you guys what the writing prompt for this week is. So Saw a couple of hand claps. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing the screen again. So here is your writing prompt for this week. Esta semana su tema de escritura es: adopte la voz de su comunidad. Tome un papel. Escriba un poema usando la voz de ese personaje. For this week, assume the voice of your community. Play a role. Write a poem in that persona's voice. And what I mean by play a role is to think about the second definition of persona, specifically this one. An individual's social facade or front that, especially in the analytic psychology of Carl Jung, reflects the role in life the individual is playing. En español, personaje significa las fachadas sociales de un ser, especialmente en la psicología analítica de Carl Jung, que refleja el papel que toma uno durante su vida. So again, the writing prompt is: assume the voice of your community, play a role, and write a poem in that persona's voice. Adopte la voz de su comunidad, tome un papel y escriba un poema usando la voz de ese personaje. To really think about, what are some of the facades, what are some of the social facades that a person might need to take on to represent a community, to represent their community. And hopefully you can use that as a tool for expressing some sort of role that maybe needs to be expressed. I mean, in the case of the Courtney Burroughs poem, I would argue that Addie, the voice of Addie, the one black doll, using that role of the one black doll in a diversity training, is a way to comment on the need for diversity training to begin with. It's sad that we need it, but you know what? Our society says that we need it because of the structural inequalities that exist. So if you see that in your own community, in that community that you identify with, speak to that. I challenge you to speak to it. Take that role and try to address it. Wait, Mauricio, are you saying you want me to recite the poem in Mark Hamill's voice?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
I'll try, but honestly, I don't know if I could ever do Mark Hamill as the Joker. He's genius.
You can play the persona, Mark.
Can I just make one last comment about the whole the mandatory trainings or whatnot? I just think it's I think yes, as it's sad that as a society we need these, but it's also I feel like a lot of them are performative because it's you can't it's not, and I think this is why some of them don't work is it's because it's in an hour or however long you're not going to be able to dismantle all of these constructs of patriarchy and racism or whatnot. And so it's I don't know, so it becomes really performative, oh, we're going to spend this and now we can push it aside versus an everyday sort of thing that you have to work on. You have to dismantle and in your own head because you've been learned all these, all these really toxic behaviors and stuff. So it's I think that's also something that poem speaks to is that this isn't these mandatory trainings are not nearly enough to actually combat racism.
Kato, I agree 100% with you. The little time that I spent in the managerial position, I can tell you straight up, that's not their purpose at all. Their purpose is so that there's something on paper in case an employee does file a sexual harassment case, that at least all the employees were informed of what they shouldn't do. So it really isn't a way to take down these types of patriarchal, roles and type this monumental thing. It's really just for them to cover their ass. Which is unfortunate because, what you said is what we actually need, but how corporate America sees it, and maybe not corporate America, businesses and places of work in general only see it as this is something we have to deal with now.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Luz.
Can I chime something in? It's just coincidentally, I was listening to KPFK earlier today, and they were interviewing an author, a book called Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias. And it's just exactly what we're talking about. I mean, that in an hour, yeah, you can't learn that in an hour. It's a process, a lifetime process, and that it entails energy from everyone to want to be able to understand people, everyone around them. So, and that none of us have, or that we don't have the energy, or we don't have the inclination, or that's part of the problem. So, I just think it was. I have to agree with Caro as well.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with everything that's been said, and just like Mauricio says in the chat, it should be embedded in the culture of the workplace. It absolutely does need to be embedded there. And if it's not, and you work in a place, in an environment, or you have to navigate an environment that isn't inclusive, I think that it's okay to actually call it out. There's only so much that I think that a person that is, like at an employee level could do, but it's also really important for the person that's in power to have that, to provide that space, right? So yes, it's part of the culture of the workplace, and yes, as an employee, you could call out other employees, and you could even call out your boss. But ultimately, it comes down to the bosses, right? The people that are in power are the ones that have to create those spaces. And so the more we can create those spaces in our community here to have these conversations, I think through your writing, you could hopefully get to that person that is in a position of power, that is able to make those changes for a workplace culture. And I think that is the power that we all have as writers, because yeah, maybe a 1 hour training may not speak to somebody, but you know what? A poem does. People carry poems with them every day. Poems that they've read, or even just a line from a poem that they've read that somehow spoke to them. So that's really the power that you have. We're not necessarily powerless, in the positions that we're in. We have a lot of strength, and your voice is what really matters. So that's why taking on a persona this week is hopefully going to be a challenge that you can take on to maybe make some of these cultural changes. Because that's really what we're aiming for here. We're aiming to shift culture to acknowledge who we are as a community, who you are as a community, because you are the one that really is valuable here. Your voice is important. So that's my little diatribe. I hope I didn't rant for too long there, but I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say. And as a little side note for next week I'm planning on actually not having a lesson. Next week, I want us to just simply share the work that's been done up to this point. So, we're going to try to do some kind of like a workshop session where everybody gets to share their work, and those that want to share at least. And we'll hopefully be able to give each other feedback throughout the week, or throughout the session, I mean. So just know next week, that's kind of the plan. I hope you're able to attend and get feedback on your writing. If you want to have me actually share the screen for you with your work, I'm more than happy to do that. Just let me know when you turn in something this week on Google Classroom. But all of you actually should have the ability to share your screen too. So I suggest looking up how to share your screen using whatever device you're on. And on Google Classroom, I'll also put a little video, like a little tutorial video, to help you find how to do that. Hopefully, it'll be for both the mobile version as well as the desktop version. And Miss Luz, you're asking if next week will be recorded. I think next week we could probably skip on the recording, if that's okay with you guys. Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah, we don't want to, give away too many spoilers for the zine, right? All right. So thank you guys. You know what, Mauricio? Don't be like that, man. Don't be like that. So, peinar means comb, just in case you guys were wondering. So yeah, so next week, just yeah, be prepared to share if you want to share. Otherwise, let's just help your fellow classmates out by giving some feedback. So with that, I guess I'll say good night. It's good to see everyone. Que pasen una linda noche, una linda semana. Y los veo aquí de hoy en ocho. Take care, guys. Bye.
Have a good night, all. Have a good week.
You too.
Night.
Good night,
Ciao.
everybody.
Bye.
Buenas noches.
Bye.
Right.